13-year-old Marcus Thompson stood nervously at the gates of Crestwood Academy, gripping the straps of his worn-out backpack. The prestigious private school towered before him, its old stone walls and ivy-covered towers symbolizing wealth and centuries of tradition. To Marcus, it felt like stepping into a different world. As the newest scholarship student, he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong here. He was one of the few black students, and, from the looks of it, the only one in his grade. "Remember what your father always said, Marcus," his mother had whispered that morning as she straightened his shirt collar. "Your mind is your greatest tool. Play it well." Marcus nodded, pushing down his nerves. This scholarship was his family's big break, his ticket out of their struggling neighborhood, out of poverty. As the bell rang, signaling the start of the day, students flooded past him, laughing and chatting about their summer vacations in Europe and skiing trips to Aspen. Marcus tightened his grip on his bag and stepped into the unknown, trying not to let the weight of his difference weigh him down. "You must be Marcus," said a tall man with warm eyes, stopping in front of him. "I'm Mr. Adams, your history teacher. Principal Miller asked me to give you a tour." Marcus felt a wave of relief flood over him. Mr. Adams was the first black face he'd seen since arriving. "Thank you, sir," Marcus said softly, his voice barely a whisper. They walked down the long hallways, Mr. Adams pointing out different classrooms and lockers. "Most of the staff here are good people," he said, carefully choosing his words. "But it might take them some time to adjust." Marcus knew exactly what he meant. He'd been the new kid before, the one who had to work twice as hard to be seen half as much. When they reached the music room, Marcus paused at the sight of a grand piano through the glass. "Do you play?" Mr. Adams asked. Marcus shook his head, the answer coming automatically. "No, sir." It was easier than explaining the late nights spent learning violin from Grandpa Elijah in their cramped apartment. That violin now sat wrapped in cloth at the back of his closet, tucked away like a secret. In English class, Marcus took a seat at the back. Mrs. Langston, the teacher, was clearly surprised by the depth of his analysis during their discussion of To Kill a Mockingbird. "Well," she said, raising an eyebrow, "someone did their summer reading." A few students turned and stared at him. Marcus kept his head down, not wanting to attract any more attention than necessary. Lunchtime was even worse. Marcus sat alone at the cafeteria table, picking at his food as conversations around him buzzed with tales of family vacations in Italy and summer camps in New England. It felt like everyone in the room was living in a world he couldn't quite access. "Hey," said a voice. A girl with long, dark hair sat across from him. "I'm Isabella. Your analysis in English class was amazing." Marcus blinked, surprised. "Thanks. I'm Marcus." Isabella smiled warmly. "I know. New kids like you always stand out, especially the smart ones." For the first time that day, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. It felt like a tiny victory in a sea of isolation, but that small spark of hope was crushed the next morning. Marcus saw his schedule, and his heart sank. His first class was music with Mrs. Whitman. The music room was a grand space, with polished wooden floors, high ceilings, and crystal chandeliers that made it feel more like a concert hall than a classroom. Mrs. Whitman swept into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She was tall, pale, and her platinum blonde hair was pulled tightly into a bun. Her posture was as rigid as her expression. "Welcome to Advanced Music Appreciation," she announced, her voice as sharp as a knife. "I expect nothing less than perfection from each of you." Her eyes lingered on Marcus for a moment. The other students began introducing themselves, each listing impressive musical accomplishments, private piano lessons, youth orchestras, summer programs at Juilliard. When it was Marcus's turn, he hesitated. "I'm new," he said simply, "and I've only ever learned music with my grandfather." Mrs. Whitman's eyes narrowed. "With your grandfather? I see. And where did he study music?" "He didn't study at any school. He taught me himself," Marcus said quietly. He could feel the weight of her judgment, the unspoken question hanging in the air. "Perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your skills?" Mrs. Whitman said, her tone dripping with condescension. She gestured toward a shelf lined with various instruments. "The violin, perhaps?" Marcus stood up slowly, his heart pounding. He walked to the front of the class and took the violin she handed him. It felt light in his hands, the bow stiff and unyielding. "I'd rather play something more suited to this instrument," he muttered. The laughter spread quickly. From behind, a student whispered, "Let's see if he knows anything about music other than street beats." But Marcus wasn't deterred. He lifted the violin and said calmly, "The bridge is misaligned. It'll affect the sound." Mrs. Whitman's face turned cold, but she said nothing. "Play it as it is," she ordered. After class, Marcus felt the sting of embarrassment, but he didn't let it break him. As he walked out of the room, Leela, a girl from his English class, caught up with him. "That was harsh," she said, her voice sympathetic. "But I saw what you were trying to do. You have real talent. Don't let her get to you." Marcus gave a small nod. "I guess it doesn't really matter anyway." Lila frowned. "It does matter. Trust me. People like Mrs. Whitman are just stuck in the past. You're different. You have something they don't even understand." That night, Marcus returned home to the small apartment he shared with his mother. In the quiet of their living room, he pulled out the old leather case from the back of the closet. Inside, the violin his grandfather had given him when he was just a child. The amber wood had been worn by time, but it still gleamed with the same warmth it had when his grandfather played it. He remembered those nights, standing in the living room as his grandfather adjusted his grip on the violin. "The violin," his grandfather had said, "is like telling a secret. It speaks where words can't." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the memories. The lessons continued for years. While other kids were outside playing, Marcus was inside practicing, his fingers aching from hours of playing. But his grandfather never asked for perfection, only for honesty through the music. When his grandfather passed away 2 years ago, his last words to Marcus were, "Play for those who need to hear it." Now, Marcus played again. Bach's Partita No. 2 in D minor filled the small apartment, the sorrow, the frustration, and the hope pouring out of the strings. His heart bled into every note. When he finished, he turned to find his mother standing in the doorway, tears in her eyes. "You sound just like him," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The next day, Marcus asked Mr. Adams about the upcoming spring concert. "Are you thinking of auditioning?" Mr. Adams asked, his eyebrows raised in surprise. Marcus nodded. "I've been practicing. Good music deserves to be heard." Mr. Adams smiled warmly. "Well, good luck. You deserve it." Marcus smiled back. The road ahead wasn't easy, but for the first time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. Weeks passed, and Marcus continued practicing in secret. He spent every spare moment honing his skills, each note a step toward proving himself. It wasn't easy. The pressure to fit in, to prove he belonged, weighed heavily on his shoulders. Every time he faced Mrs. Whitman's cold gaze or overheard whispers in the hallway, the doubt crept back in. But he pushed through, determined. One afternoon, while practicing in the abandoned music room, Lila found him again. She had been keeping her eye on Marcus, seeing something in him that others seemed to overlook. "You're getting better," she said, watching as his bow danced over the strings. "You know, Mrs. Whitman won't let you in the concert unless you have the right connections." Marcus sighed, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "I'm not even sure it's worth trying. She made it pretty clear that I don't belong here." Lila crossed her arms, her expression serious. "That's not true. She's just threatened by you, Marcus. Your talent is something they don't know how to handle. But you can't let that stop you." The next morning, Marcus walked into Mrs. Whitman's office after class. He was nervous, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. "I'd like to audition for the concert," he said, his voice steady. "And I'd like to play the Dvorak concerto." Mrs. Whitman raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a tight smile. "You're ambitious. I'll give you that," she said, leaning back in her chair. "But you're not a senior, and you certainly haven't earned a spot to play a piece like that." Marcus stood tall, unwavering. "Then let me prove I can. I've been playing for years, and I've worked hard for this." There was a long pause before Mrs. Whitman finally spoke. "Fine," she said, her voice cold. "You can audition, but don't expect any favors." As Marcus left the room, he felt a mixture of relief and fear. He had taken the first step, but the real battle was just beginning. That evening, Marcus practiced harder than ever before. He played through the Dvorak concerto over and over, each time pushing himself further. The music flowed from him, his fingers moving with precision, the notes carrying the weight of his journey, his struggles, his dreams, and the voices of those who had been silenced for far too long. The day of the audition arrived, and Marcus felt a tight knot in his stomach. As he walked toward the stage, his hands were clammy, his heartbeat quickened. He had practiced for hours, but now, in the spotlight, doubt crept in again. The auditorium was packed. Students and teachers all gathered to watch the auditions. Mrs. Whitman stood at the front, her arms crossed, an air of superiority surrounding her. Marcus felt her cold gaze as he walked toward the piano, but he kept his focus on the violin case in his hand. As he opened the case, the weight of his grandfather's violin seemed to ground him. It was more than just an instrument. It was a piece of his history, his identity. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Whenever you're ready, Marcus," Mrs. Whitman called out, her voice piercing the silence. Marcus nodded, and with one final glance at the audience, he raised the violin to his chin. The bow touched the strings, and for a brief moment, the world outside faded away. It was just him and the music. The first notes of Dvorak's Concerto in A minor filled the room. The sound was rich, powerful, every note a declaration of who he was. Marcus's fingers danced over the strings, the music flowing through him with an intensity that made the air vibrate. Mrs. Whitman watched, her expression unreadable. The audience was silent, hanging on every note. Marcus poured everything into his performance, his soul laid bare with each phrase. When he finished, the room was still for a long moment. Finally, Professor Harris, who had been sitting at the back of the room, stood and began to clap. The sound echoed through the hall, and soon the entire auditorium joined in. A standing ovation. Marcus stood frozen, not believing what he was hearing. The applause was overwhelming, but it was the smile on Professor Harris's face that truly shook him. "Not just a performance," Professor Harris said, stepping toward Marcus. "That was a conversation across generations." Mrs. Whitman stood silent, her face unreadable, but there was a flicker in her eyes. For the first time, she seemed to be reconsidering her judgment. Later, Marcus stood in front of the headmaster's office, his heart racing. The decision was being made now. Would he be allowed to perform in the concert? Would they see his worth? The door opened, and Principal Reynolds looked at him with a serious expression. "Marcus, I've spoken with Professor Harris, and I've listened to your audition. You'll be performing at the concert. Not as a last-minute replacement, but as the featured soloist." Marcus's heart soared. It was happening. He had done it. He was going to play. The night of the concert arrived, and the auditorium buzzed with excitement. The students were all dressed in their finest clothes, the air thick with anticipation. Marcus stood backstage, gripping the neck of his violin, heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the murmurs of the audience, the soft rustle of their programs as they eagerly awaited the performance. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. This was it. Everything had led up to this moment. The audition, the struggle, the doubts. Tonight he would play for those who had been silenced, for his grandfather, and for himself. When it was finally his turn, Marcus stepped onto the stage, the bright lights blinding him for a moment. The audience fell silent, all eyes on him. He could feel the weight of their expectations, but he refused to be intimidated. He looked out into the crowd, searching for the familiar faces of Lila, Mr. Bennett, and his mother. When he found them, he felt a surge of strength. The orchestra began to play, and Marcus joined them, the first notes of the Dvorak concerto filling the hall. His fingers moved with grace, each note resonating through the air like a message, a story. The tension in his body faded as the music took over, and for the first time, he felt truly free. With each movement, Marcus felt himself connect to something deeper, something bigger than the classroom, bigger than the school. It was as if he was playing not just for the audience in front of him, but for every person who had ever been overlooked, for every voice that had ever been silenced. The final notes echoed through the hall, and the audience stood in unison, clapping, cheering. For a moment, Marcus couldn't believe it. He had done it. The ovation was thunderous, a wave of approval that filled the space and left him breathless. After the performance, Principal Reynolds approached Marcus, his face beaming. "You were incredible tonight," he said, shaking Marcus's hand. "That was one of the most powerful performances I've ever witnessed." Marcus smiled, still feeling the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Thank you, sir. It was an honor." As the night came to a close, Marcus found his mother in the crowd. She was crying, tears of pride and joy in her eyes. "You were amazing, Marcus," she whispered, hugging him tightly. "Your grandfather would have been so proud." Marcus nodded, his heart full. He had done it. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had believed in him, for every person who had ever felt invisible. He had found his voice. That night, as the applause continued to echo in his ears, Marcus knew one thing for sure. His music, like truth, would always find a way to be heard. Weeks passed after the concert, and life at Northbridge Academy began to settle into its usual rhythm. Marcus continued his studies, but his reputation as a gifted musician had spread across the school. He was no longer the quiet scholarship student. He was the violin prodigy, the one who had earned the respect of both students and teachers alike. One afternoon, Marcus sat in the music room, practicing a new piece. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting warm golden light on his violin. It was quiet in the room, the only sound the gentle hum of the strings as his bow moved across them. As he played, he thought about his grandfather. He remembered how Elijah Carter had taught him, not just the notes, but the soul of the music, the truth it carried. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice. "Music is not just sound, Marcus. It's a story, a conversation between the past and the present. Suddenly, the door to the music room opened, and Leela stepped in. She had a big smile on her face, her eyes bright with excitement. "Marcus, I have some news," she exclaimed. Marcus put down his violin and raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "The school is starting a new scholarship program," Lila said. "It's going to be called the Elijah Carter Music Scholarship. They want to honor your grandfather's legacy, and they want you to be the first recipient." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "What? Really?" Lila nodded, her smile widening. "Yep, it's official. They've already spoken to your mom, and they're making the announcement next week." Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat. The idea of his grandfather's name being honored in this way, it was overwhelming. He had always dreamed of being able to share his music with the world, but this felt like something more. It was a way of making sure that his grandfather's influence would live on, that his legacy would continue to inspire. "I don't even know what to say," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Lila grinned. "You don't have to say anything. You've earned it. Your music speaks for itself." Marcus smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. He picked up his violin again, holding it gently in his hands. He thought about his grandfather once more, and the legacy that was now being carried on through him. "I'll make sure the music keeps playing," Marcus said softly. "For him. For all of us."